Again, want to welcome everyone this afternoon to our presentation by the Columbia College Alumni Association. I'm Keith McIver, Director of Alumni Development. Giving folks a few seconds to finally register, I wanted to share an update from Columbia College with you. Wow. You see, we have a lot of exciting and spirited things going on here at Columbia College. Again, good afternoon from snowy Columbia, Missouri. I'm Keith McIver, Director of Alumni Development. And welcome to the first installment of Cougar Conversations, hosted by the Columbia College Alumni Association. Our mission at CCAA is to connect all of our alumni, Christian college, day campus, nationwide, and our online platforms to engage your participation, keep you connected, and request support of Columbia College. I'm proud to recognize alumni from across the country in different time zones to this event. This pandemic has given us an opportunity to celebrate. I'm proud that these virtual events have allowed us to be in one location at once. We have our CC Board of Directors as well as our CC Advisory Board members present. Thank you very much. And we currently have around 50 people who registered for this event. They represent 9 states: Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Kansas, Maryland, of course, Missouri here, and New York, Texas, and Wisconsin, plus 2 additional countries, Australia and Denmark. We have representation from every alumni decade from the 60s to recent graduates of 2020. Cougar Conversations is offered, screen just went out. Okay, Cougar Conversations is offered to provide current, topical, and educational dialogue about issues facing our society and to allow Columbia College to remain relevant with them. But this decision to address the 2020 election was not requested lightly. The alumni office staff and our vice president, Susan Rothwell, just kind of looked at me. Dean of the School of Humanities and Arts and Sciences, Dr. Lisa Ford Brown, she just kind of said, okay. But our Columbia College president, Dr. Scott Dalrymple, he agreed. Who better can navigate and educate our alumni on this subject during this such a divisive time than Dr. Terry Smith? Dr. Terry B. Smith is a longtime history and political science professor who served as executive vice president and dean for academic affairs from 1996 to 2015, and interim president from 2013 to 14, following the retirement of President Gerald Bruder. Dr. Smith is a graduate of CMU, as well as having his master's and PhD from Michigan State University. He was a Fulbright scholar and attended the Institute for Educational Management at Harvard University. He teaches numerous classes on American politics here at Columbia College. Dr. Smith is also highly regarded in this community, and it was my intention to share him with this nationwide alumni audience. Dr. Smith serves as a radio and TV analyst, especially in providing political commentary on the local radio station, while remaining remarkably nonpartisan. Dr. Smith also serves on several local boards. He and his wife, Jane, have 4 grown children, 8 grandchildren, and he is a lifetime Cardinals fan. Dr. Smith is one of our most popular professors on campus among his colleagues and with the students. On any given day pre-pandemic, one would see Dr. Smith regularly working out in the gym or playing pool with the students. We were honored to name the 2nd floor lounge of New Hall, just past 2 years ago, the Dr. Terry B. Smith Lounge. First, ground rules. This presentation is made in a webinar format. Dr. Smith and I, who will serve as moderators, cannot see or hear you. The chat functions have been disabled, but we encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom. You may use your class year and location should you wish to, but of course, we're all CC alumni. So let us begin. Dr. Smith, there you are.
Hey,
So
thank you. Go ahead, sorry.
Thank you, sir. No, just handing it over to you.
No, I'm eager to jump in. Welcome to the alumni. Keith, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. I love political science. I love students. I love to teach. I love Columbia College. Big Cougars fan as well. So this is really fun, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you. And hopefully you'll take away some information that you didn't have about elections and about the Constitution, but be sure that if there are things that are follow-ups or not clear, that you do let us know through the chat. And Keith and I will have a dialogue periodically as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the slide presentation. So when I teach my classes in American politics and government, they're all based in the Constitution. In fact, when I teach my American government class, we read every word of it. It takes a couple of weeks. It is a very interactive, and you can imagine how much fun it is for me. And every time I read it, I find something new in it. It's an amazing document. It does set up some, not very much, guidelines for conducting presidential and congressional elections. And the one that sets up the presidential election is found in Article 2 of the Constitution, the first section of the third clause. So when we get to this in the class, I say, okay, don't read this now. This is late 18th century English legalese. We will get to the 21st century version of this later in the text. All you need to know right now is that the president is not directly elected by you and me. The founding fathers back in the day were revolutionary in a couple of ways. One is they created a national legislature that was directly elected by the people, the first in world history, the United States House of Representatives. And they created a federal structure where states and the national government shared a lot of power. But they didn't go all the way to let the American people elect a president. They interposed between the office of the president and the voters, this institution called the Electoral College. So what what we'll be doing a week from tomorrow is when we vote for president, voting for electors. And then in December, those electors will gather in all the state capitals and will formally then cast the votes for the president. That will be reported that day to the Washington, D.C., and then it'll be announced. The official result of the election won't be announced until January, when Congress convenes and ratifies essentially the choice of the electors.
So Dr. Smith, this is the Electoral College in the Constitution.
Yes, yeah. So this is the clause that's in the Constitution about the Electoral College. So the founding fathers kind of had an unrealistic assumption about who was going to be president. They sort of thought everybody was going to be George Washington. And they also didn't think that there were going to be political parties. Joke on them. George Washington was one of a kind, and political parties, which were kind of existing at the time anyhow, except unnamed, emerged in the election of 1800, which was a disaster. What the Electoral College did was basically create a situation where the person with the most electoral votes was the president, and the person with the second most electoral votes was the vice president. Maybe that would have worked in 1800, although it didn't, because they recognized that it was a real problem. Can you imagine how that would have worked in 2016? It would have been President Donald Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton. Not such a great outcome. So one of the very first amendments to the United States Constitution was the 12th Amendment, which was amended very shortly, like 1803. And it changed the whole process. Again, I refer you to the Constitution. You can take a look at it yourself. But what it basically did was two things: implicitly acknowledge the existence of political parties, and that it was not a good idea to assume that George Washington was going to be on the ballot for the rest of time. And it also made sure that the person with the number two, the second most electoral votes, was not the vice president, because obviously that person was going to be the person who was competing to be president. But in any case, and we'll get later in the presentation, we'll see how this plays out in current elections. So the key is the election of the president is a very indirect one. Next slide, please. So we're racing through American history here. And what I want to do is run up to the 2016 election, which is sort of the foundational election for what we're looking at a week from tomorrow, and look at some really critical precursor elections and why they were critical. So the first one was 1932, although there were some that were earlier in American history that were critical, but the most recent ones are the ones that we need to pay the most attention to. So obviously the United States was in the midst of a depression, and all of these critical elections are characterized by three things, by the way. One is that they take place during some sort of national crisis. And secondly, they also are involve either the rise of a strong third party or the splintering of one of the major parties. So this is what happened in 1932. The Republicans had dominated American politics from 1896, with the exception of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And but the Depression came along. Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and he assembled a coalition, a very diverse coalition. It was unstable, as it turns out, although it lasted a long time. But right before the 32 election, there was a party called the Progressive Party that was sort of located in the upper Midwest. That's where it was concentrated. And a lot of their ideas were taken by the Democrats. And so this New Deal coalition of urban liberals and Southern whites and African Americans and farmers dominated American politics until 1968, which is the next critical election. If you'll put that slide up, thank you. So the big issues that year were civil rights and the end of the civil rights movement, or at least toward the end of it. It took place during the entirety of the 60s. But it was in the 1968 election, it was a very hot issue. And also, of course, the Vietnam War was at its peak, or nadir, however you wish to look at it, at this time as well. Also, there was a third party that arose. It was a Southern party, the American Independent Party. It was its candidate was George Wallace, who was the governor of the segregationist states' rights governor of Alabama. And he actually carried the electoral votes of 5 Southern states. It's the last time that somebody other than a Democrat or Republican has carried electoral votes in a presidential election. So Richard Nixon was elected, and this began a period that went on until 2000, in which the parties traded presidencies, while the Democrats, still feeling the effects of the New Deal coalition, continued to dominate Congress, with the exception of a very short period of time. 1994, of course, Democrats lost Congress for the first time since the 1950s, and Republicans have had Congress most of the time since then. But the 2000 election was a critical one for several reasons. One was that technology was the big issue. It doesn't seem like it. It doesn't look like it. You kind of think, wow, I don't remember that. Well, in retrospect, the internet was rising. .com, there was a .com boom and then bust immediately thereafter, and social media was getting underway. But this was one of these pivotal elections. It was also just preceded by Ross Perot and his party, the Reform Party. And so, and it was also a disputed election. We'll spend more time on that in a few minutes about how it was disputed. But so the 2000, so basically what you see is these three elections, a national crisis, or at least a big issue that was sort of roiling the society, a third party, but also if you take a look at the intervals, about a generation between them. And if you look,
each generation has these critical elections you're posting.
say that again, Keith, sorry.
They all have these sort of critical elections. That's kind of this, what I'm saying. Each generation has these make or break elections, it seems.
Yeah, each of the critical elections, and if you go back to 1896 and 1860, all of them basically feature the same thing. Some national crisis, the rise of a third party or a party split, and about a generation between. So we're not quite due for another one yet, but then everything's different now, so who knows? Okay, keep going, Keith, with the, yeah. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about voting rights. This is sort of an important part of a parallel conversation because first of all, it comes straight from the Constitution. And then secondly, it has a significant impact on the 2020 election. So if you take a look at the US Constitution, and if you consider the Bill of Rights as part of the original package, then you've got 17 amendments. Two of them cancel each other out, the prohibition, 18th, and then the repeal of prohibition, the 21st. So now you're left with 15. More than half of the amendments to the US Constitution are about voting. So let's go through some of them. We've already talked about the 12th Amendment that changed the Electoral College. The 15th was the next one in 1870, was part of the three amendments that were called the Reconstruction Amendment that were right after the Civil War. It gave African Americans the right to vote, predominantly in the South. And this was in fact enforced vigorously for about 6 or 8 years. There was a tainted election in 1876 where the Republican winner made a deal with some Southern states, basically said, we will stop Reconstruction if you'll make sure that your electors vote for me. That deal was consummated. Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow laws went into effect in the South, and the South had this terrible racial situation basically until the 1960s, but more on that in a minute. So 15th Amendment, 17th Amendment, the original Constitution had state legislatures electing US senators. Part of the progressive movement that was going on in the early part of the 20th century that really kind of culminated in the New Deal. One of the progressive initiatives was the direct election of senators. And so now senators are elected to their 6-year terms by voters, just like members of the US House are. And then the next one was the 19th Amendment. This gave the women the right to vote. This is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. The women had the right to vote in many, many states. Way back in the 1800s, some of the Western states gave women the right to vote right away because they needed women in the population, and they were using all kinds of inducements. One of them being, hey, if you come to Wyoming, you can vote. But this was an important expansion of the franchise, of course, as well. Next one would be the 22nd Amendment, which limited the president to 2 terms. So the president has a 2-term limit. Obviously, it had not before. George Washington had voluntarily ended his presidency after 2 terms. Then Franklin Roosevelt was the first one who violated that informal precedent. It wasn't in the Constitution anywhere. And so the president then became limited to two terms. Senators are not limited to any number of terms. Members of the House are not limited to any number of terms. 15 of the states have term limits, Missouri being one of those. but the president is the only one constitutional officer that has term limits. Supreme Court justices obviously do not. They have lifetime terms. Next one was the 23rd Amendment. Until 1961, the residents of the District of Columbia, and there are 600, 700,000 of them, did not have a vote for the president. And that amendment gave the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. The next one was the 24th Amendment. This was at the peak of the civil rights movement, and it banned the poll tax. The poll tax was a tax that was levied on Southerners. You paid this tax in order to be able to register to vote. And whites and blacks both paid it, but it had a disproportionate impact on blacks because so many more of them were in poverty. So this was an amendment that basically said you can't charge people to vote anymore. And then the next one and the last one was the 26th Amendment in 1971. That date is critical because the Vietnam War was still going on. The argument at the time was, many of you remember, if old enough to fight, old enough to vote. At that time, most states, many states had a 21-year vote, a 21-year-old minimum for voting. And the 26th Amendment said, if you're 18, then you have the right to vote. So in the United States, then, in theory, if you're 18 years old and you're a citizen and you are not institutionalized, and in some states not a felon, then you can vote, or at least you can register to vote. There are some, and so we will get into, kind of voting a little bit more in a minute. So the next one then, Keith, is, and this is not a constitutional amendment, but is probably the most important bill ever passed to guarantee voting rights in the United States. And the key, the two big points here were that you could no longer require a literacy test as a qualification for voting. It was applied in a very discriminatory way in the South, and it also got the federal government involved in monitoring elections in the South. And the federal government stayed heavily involved in that until quite recently, when a Supreme Court decision loosened that up a little bit. And Keith, you probably have something to say about that picture.
I do, and thank you very much, Dr. Smith. If you all, as alumni, have received in your CC Connected email or have seen recently, the Columbia College received a valuable collection by photographer Bruce Davidson. It's valued at more than $1.2 million. And the photo that you see here is among the 360 photos by photographer Bruce Davidson, gifted to Columbia College. And we're very proud to not only have the collection, but this image specifically. I've seen this image before when I was growing up. I think many of you know that I'm from South Carolina, and this was a part of sort of the Southern incentive to vote and to register and to vote. And I had not known that it was a Bruce Davidson photo. And I'm very pleased that this is among the photos that we have here in the Columbia College Archive. So I'm very proud of that, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, and the timing's perfect because we just got it and are able to showcase it here in this presentation. So if we can go ahead. So you've heard a lot, I'm sure, if you've been following the news about vote fraud, voter suppression, et cetera. Well, let's talk about those things. One of the ways that, and suppression is a strong word, but essentially it means, keeping people who would otherwise be eligible from actually registering and voting. And by the way, let me say something about voter registration, because it'll come up in a minute. But in most countries, when you become of age, the government registers you and sends you a notification that you are now registered to vote, and the next election will be on this date, and you go place X to vote. So that's one of the reasons why turnout is higher in Britain and Germany and Holland and other Western democracies, because the first step is taken for you. In the United States, you have to register. Now, there's a historical reason for that. It hasn't always been the case that you registered, had to register to vote. But back in the 1870s and 80s, there was a tremendous amount of voter fraud, much of it in the cities, where people were voting early and often in elections. And so one of the reforms and it was a reform at that time, it really cleaned up politics, was that you had to register to vote. In many states, you have to register by party. Missouri is not one of those, but if you're in Florida or New York, for example, when you register to vote, you register by party. And then when you go to the primary election, they look you up and you say, oh, you're a Democrat, here's your ballot. It doesn't work that way in Missouri. But in any case, in the United States, you have to register. And there are some places that require you to present a government issued ID like a driver's license in order to be able to prove your identity. And there are other ways that it can make it challenging. Not everybody has a government issued ID. Also, physical access to the polls. In some places, they don't have enough polling stations. You've seen the pictures of long lines in the early voting. It doesn't have to be that way in some places. And so people sometimes wait for hours in order to vote. And bless their hearts, they're willing to stick it out. Also, unfortunately, there are some instances where voters can be intimidated by the presence of people who are, just causing trouble. And sometimes it'll be enough for people to say, I just don't feel comfortable here. I'll go someplace else or not vote at all. So this has happened. It's happening currently. The level to which it does occur is hard to quantify. However, to the next slide, voter fraud is easier to quantify. After the 2016 election, President Trump claimed that he was the victim of voter fraud in the sense that that Hillary Clinton won 3 million more popular votes than he did, and he said that that was the product of illegal voting. He set up a commission that looked into the frequency of actual voter fraud, and nationwide they found maybe 30 instances where somebody was misrepresenting himself or was intentionally trying to defraud the vote process. And so the commission dissolved basically quickly because they didn't have any business. So you hear about voter fraud, there's just simply not much evidence that it's taking place. So next slide, please. So how has the government, especially in recent years, expanded the franchise? Well, we've seen how the Constitution did it. We've seen how the Voting Rights Act did it. But we also there have been other really recent improvements in how the vote takes place. Back in the 90s, the federal government passed what's called motor voter bill. Help America Vote Act was the official name of it. And essentially, it made it possible for when you go to a public business like the driver's license office, where you get your tags or your driver's license, there you can find the form to fill out to register to vote. Back in the 90s, in Columbia City public buses, there was a tray in which there were forms a voter registration form. So the Missouri and Columbia in particular has tried to make it easy for people to register to vote. You still have to go through the process, and there's certain kinds of proofs that you have to provide that you are in fact eligible and a resident. The second, but still trying to make it as easy as possible. Voting by mail, that's been going on in Oregon since the 80s. It's worked very well. Turnout is higher in Oregon. Absolutely negligible issues with fraud. They have run many elections perfectly routinely, and there is not a single polling place open in the entire state of Oregon. Everything is done by mail. And a more recent development is early voting, which has expanded the ability of people to vote. You've seen people, you've seen the pictures on the media of people online voting now. Election day is still 10 days or 8 days off. People have been voting in some states for weeks now. So now it's interesting in the United States, we have an election day that has been set, excuse me, since the 1840s. It is the it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. There's a fascinating reason for that. It has to do with medieval England and the harvest. You'll have to take my American Political Parties class to get the details on that, but there is a reason why it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday. But in any case, in the United States, it's not a holiday like it is in some countries. And in fact, of the 50 states, 20 of them don't even guarantee you in their state law time off. 30 do. Missouri is one where your employer has to let you take 3 hours to vote. But there's no federal law about it. And 20 states, it's up to the employers. But in any case, it's more of a hassle in the United States to physically vote than in many places. And still, we've got a turnout. We'll probably have 65%, which will be one of the highest that we've seen. Next one, Keith.
Dr. Smith, may I go back and just talk
Sure,
about
absolutely.
that one slide? It's great that you're giving us the history on sort of early voting. I think what's particular about 2020 is that we're in a pandemic, and early voting has become a necessity for many people. Certainly, it's been historically, you've given reasons why, but for this year, it's just a slightly different reason for voting by mail or early voting. And I think it speaks to just kind of where we are right now and sort of the anxiety of the election today.
No question about it, Keith. And my wife and I voted by mail, for that very reason. I mean, I love going to the polls. I think going to the polls and voting is one of the great communal acts of citizenship that we do. Not this year. I'm in my cubby hole and I voted, but I voted by mail. Hopefully the next time I'll be able to go back to the polls. But you're exactly right. A lot of the changes this year have been induced by the pandemic. So here we are in 2016. This is the map of the final election results. And this was the result. The outcome was a shock to lots of people, yours truly included, because there was a lot of conventional wisdom about why Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. But at the top of the list was the fact that there were enough states that had voted the previous 4 elections for a Democratic candidate to total 240 electoral votes, which meant that most people were assuming that candidate Clinton would hold those, and all she would have to do would be pick up Florida with its 29 and one more state, and she was elected. So the firewall that included Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Those are 4 of the states, 3 of the states that had been consistently Democratic. Candidate Clinton did not go to Wisconsin one time, and in retrospect, that was not a great move for her. President Trump won those states by a total of 77,000 votes, and each of them was that close. So it was just 20,000, 30,000 votes separating him from Hillary Clinton. And that was the key. Had those 3 states been Clinton states, and you can count the number of electoral votes yourself, Wisconsin 10, Michigan 16, total to 26, Pennsylvania 20, so that's 46. Drop that 46 onto Clinton, she's got 278, and you need 270 to win. There were other problems with the Clinton campaign. Those of you who think back 4 years will remember them very well. But the biggest one was she took for granted some states in the Electoral College calculus that it turned out she was not going to win. So what does it look like today? I mean, so the 2020 campaign, President Trump won the election. The Democrats did well in the 2018 congressional elections. They took back the House, although Republicans kept the Senate. And so in this campaign, we saw virtual conventions for the first time. And we also saw coming out of the convention something completely new to the world. And that was the Republican Party did not present a platform. The Democratic Party did. Everybody had always before. You know, here are where we stand on the issues. Basically, the Republican Party said we're going to keep on keeping on, and we're going to campaign on the Trump, the Trump presidency, without being specific at all. Democrats, of course, had a detailed platform. So the primary run-up to the conventions, President Trump basically was unopposed. Joe Biden, of course, there were 15 actual candidates running against him, and the key primary was the one in South Carolina, which was the week before Super Tuesday back in March, where he won an overwhelming victory in South Carolina with the overwhelming support of the African American voters there. So that kind of greased the skids for him to come into Super Tuesday, and he crushed everybody on Super Tuesday, and with Massachusetts being the most interesting example. Elizabeth Warren was a nominee at that time, Senator Warren from Massachusetts, very popular there. Right. He beat her in Massachusetts without spending a dime or spending a minute in the state. That was right after that election. Most people withdrew and endorsed him. Bernie Sanders hung in for a little while, but ended up suspending his campaign, is what they call it, and endorsing him. So now the candidates are nominated, the campaign's underway. The debates took place. I don't have to talk about the first debate. Most of you saw it probably. You probably have your own opinions about it. The second debate was canceled because President Trump got the virus. The third debate was just last week, a much tamer affair. Mm-hmm. And I think the highlights of the debates, other than the fact that the first one was totally chaotic, was the famous fly on Vice President Pence's head during that debate. So, it's funny what the things that go down in history in presidential campaigns. The other thing that often happens in presidential campaigns is that the incumbent president has so many advantages, including the ability to spring an October surprise on the electorate. President Trump had basically, there were three of them, surprises that he wanted to be able to drop in the campaign. It turned out not only was he 0 for 3, well, I'll save the rest of that sentence for a minute. So he was hopeful of having a vaccine that he could announce a vaccine would be available before the election day. Obviously, that hasn't taken place. He was hopeful of being able to get a second stimulus package passed. As it turns out, his own Senate Republican majority was uncooperative, and so he will not be able to present a stimulus package to the electorate. And he was also hopeful that there would be he could make something of his continuing effort to link the Biden family, especially the Biden son, to a scandal. And there's nothing has happened with that either. So his attempts to do an October surprise at least so far, still got a week till the election, have not borne fruit. However, it's possible that there's a kind of October surprise that will work against him, and that is what came out of DC this weekend with his chief of staff, Mark Meadows' announcement that the administration government can't control the virus, and has essentially thrown in the towel on the federal government's fighting the coronavirus. I don't know, you'll have your own opinions about that, but my guess is that there are going to be some people, and again, lots of people have voted. 50 million people have voted already, and most of the people who have not voted have made up their minds. But this could be the kind of thing that sort of, and as we go to the slide that shows kind of where the campaign is now, and there it is. There are a number of states that are still too close to call. And let me just talk about each of those, or some of those. So if you'll take a look at down the lower left-hand corner on this map, you'll see the states where Joe Biden is ahead outside of the margin of error for polls, which means that these are states that he probably can count on winning. The bright red states are also in the same category for President Trump. But you can see the disparity there. 232 states that Joe Biden has currently. All he needs then to get the 270 is to pick up 38 electoral votes from those gray states. So if you look around, you'll see, for example, Michigan is light blue. That's a state that Trump carried. If Michigan, it looks like it's going to go for Biden at this point, and so that's 16. If you take a look at Pennsylvania, it's got 20 electoral votes. It's a toss-up state. In other words, neither candidate is outside the polling margin of error in that state, although many polls show Biden leading there. If he adds that state, then that's it. That's Biden has then his, if I'm done my math right, that gives him his 270. Have I done my math right? So 36 and 32. Yeah, no, I'm too short. So that's 268.
Perhaps Wisconsin.
Yeah. So if you add Wisconsin, the other state that was the surprise state for Trump, then that is that gives him the 270 he needs. Florida is clearly in play. The fact that Texas and Georgia are toss-up states right now, although the chances are they will end up Trump states, is a testimony to how this campaign is going. And so much of it will depend on turnout and in the and how many people actually show up to vote. And both of course both parties are working it hard. So as you're looking at that map, you can sort of see, the South still quite solidly Republican, the Midwest quite solidly Republican, the coastal states and the Northeast quite solidly Democratic, but some states in play this year that haven't been in play for a Democrat in quite some time, including Iowa to the north of us, which has been a swing state for many years. So next slide, please. So here we are, 2020. It's a very challenging. The country is bitterly polarized. Too many people see people in the other party as the enemy. social media is exacerbating these problems, and you know, just people are taking sides and are not willing to hear the point of view of other people. So, you know, how do we get to this point? Let me just speculate in a couple of ways. One is that the media have been given license in recent decades to kind of go in this direction. And really, one of the ways that this got started was back in the 1980s, because until 1985, there was what was called the Fairness Doctrine. And if you got on the radio or television and you articulated a political point of view, then somebody from an opposing point of view had the right to equal time. Well, the Federal Communication Commission required that. That was done away with in 1985, which gave the rise to political talk radio, which is 90% conservative. 90% of the political talk radio is conservative, Rush Limbaugh being only the most prominent example of that. So the talk radio has a conservative slant to it, and of course it's very active. Also, the rise of Fox News, which is a conservative news outlet. It is the counterbalance is MSNBC, but it is not nearly as influential or doesn't have nearly the viewership as Fox. And then the kind of just, you know, people have the coarsening of public discourse has been distressing to a lot of people, and people are just, I mean, families have broken up, churches have broken up, clubs have broken up over it. There are just not places to get together to civilly talk about politics like there used to be. Hopefully what we're doing right now is one. The other thing that I would want to say is I think that part of this is because we have neglected civic education in this country. There are too many pieces of evidence about how our children are not learning the Constitution, or not learning about government, American government, or governments, you know, or you know, world politics for that matter, but certainly American government and politics. One of the reasons that we go through the Constitution, every word of it, in my class is because they ain't ever done it before. And what I say almost only half jokingly after we finish with the Constitution in my class is, okay, ladies and gentlemen, the rest of this class is review, which is, like I said, I'm only half joking, because everything that we talk about the rest of the semester traces back to the Constitution and to the separation of powers and checks and balances that the founding fathers set up, and also to the ugly, nasty compromises that they made in order to get the slave states to vote yes for the document back in 1789. So that's all part of our history as well. So I think we need to renew our calls for civic education at the college. I wish that American national government was required to graduate. Not because I would get to teach it a lot, which I would love to do, but simply because I think that people need to graduate from college with a fundamental understanding of how their country works. But certainly we need to renew that the civic education K-12 as well. Keith, next.
All right.
I think we have reached the end of my presentation, and I am more than happy to, with Keith, answer your questions, elaborate on points. I'll be around afterward. You'll get my email address if you want to follow up. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope this has been at least mildly informative for you, and that you have a little bit better understanding of the kinds of things that go into a campaign and an election. This is a fabulous country, and we have lots to be thankful for. We've got a lot of problems that we've got to fix. But the election that is coming up, be sure that you vote, be sure that your vote counts, and then be sure that you accept the results of it when they become official. So,
all right. Dr. Smith, we actually have a few questions in the Q&A panel, and I'd like to share a few of them with you. One of the questions by a Columbia College staff member asked about the Electoral College specifically, and if it has so much weight, people are sometimes hesitant to vote because the Electoral College has a final say-so. My vote doesn't count mentality about the Electoral College. Do we really need it at this time?
Well, that's a topic for another webinar, and it's a great question. It was the product of a compromise, like several things were, and it's creaked along. 2 of the last 5 elections, the popular vote and the electoral vote have not favored the same candidate. So is it broken? Some people think so. So what do? You go to a direct election where you get, first of all, it's very, very difficult to amend the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution's been around, including the Bill of Rights, since 1789. There have been 17 amendments. That's what, 1 every 15 years? 2 of them canceled each other out. Yeah, it's really tough to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify a constitutional amendment. And it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to even propose one. So big states have reasons to like the Electoral College. Small states have different reasons to like the Electoral College. It would take a constitutional amendment to fix it. But let's say you go to direct election. So how do you decide who wins? Is it the person with the most votes? What if somebody has 40% and then the next candidate has 39%, and then 4 or 5 other candidates split up the rest? Does the candidate with 40% win? Do you have a runoff? There are various proposals and for it to reform the Electoral College, but it's at least creaky. And I would say that if there's a different result this year, like there was in 2016, let's say President Trump wins the Electoral College vote, there's almost no chance he's going to win the popular college vote. I think there will be much more serious proposals to do away with it.
Dr. Smith, there are a lot of questions here, and I appreciate my colleagues bringing them up there, but they're talking about the Supreme Court nomination and the confirmation that was held today. One of our vice presidents is asking about the term originalism as she's viewing the Constitution, and how much weight we can put on originalism as a principle, as the founders intended. How much weight should we put on that?
Well, first of all, it's the definition of originalism seems to be what was the intent of the founding fathers.
Yes.
Well, the intent of the founding fathers was to get a constitution ratified. So, like I said, they had to make a ton of compromises to continue slavery being the worst one until at least 1808. Obviously, it continued well beyond that. But I think that originalism is what you make of it. I think it has taken various forms, and various people, various Supreme Court justices have made decisions and claimed the intent of the founding fathers. It's a slippery term. We'll see. Obviously, Judge Barrett, when she takes office, which could be soon, like today, maybe or this week, she'll immediately get involved, and then we'll see how that translates into her decision making. I don't have much more to say about it than that, but it is a one way of looking at at making Supreme Court decisions that's different from saying we need to sort of adapt the Constitution to the times. That's kind of the other point of view.
I got it. One of the other questions, and we are close to our final hour, but one of the other questions would, how long do you think, if the Electoral College is here, how long do you think that the final decision of the election will take? Counting the ballots and making sure that everything is in place. How long do you think that'll take if the election is next
So we
week?
have some specific constitutional dates. One is the one is in December, and that is when the electors in each state get together and then cast the votes. And then the next one is in January, when Congress assembles, the new Congress, by the way, the one that is going to be elected, not the one that's sitting now, but the one that's going to be elected in next week, will sit and basically validate the results. My guess is that how contentious this will depend on the margin of victory of the winner. I just was reading today that if candidate Biden wins big, and that's one of the scenarios, it makes it a lot less likely that there will be challenges, including court challenges. If it's a very close election, like all close elections, the 2000 one certainly was an example of that, then it could be contested up to really the point at which the Congress is actually deciding, which candidate won the election. There's one wacky scenario that has Nancy Pelosi being acting president in January, because the results of none of the results from the Electoral College is certified, and so then what kicks in is the Constitution, and the Speaker of the House becomes acting president until it gets resolved.
That actually, your answer addresses one of the other vice presidents here at Columbia College asking, so thank you. We have an international student who apparently was in your class, Ian McTurk, and asking just the lens for this election, Dr. Smith, as you can imagine, is not only national, but it's international. It's the European Union and the world is looking at this election and hoping that there is a peaceful transfer of power, if there is, or just how internationally, we are the providers of democracy, or we're the spreaders of democracy around the country, especially in some of what we consider third world countries. But do you see that a lot of international countries are looking at our election as it should be, as a hallmark? It should be, something that we know how to do. And here we are kind of in this very anxiety-ridden time now.
Well, they're looking at it and they're trying to find out if we know how to do it. Our elections have been fairly routinely conducted and certainly not disputed. The 2000 one being an exception, but it was actually settled. It was settled by the Supreme Court. But the defeated candidate, right after the Supreme Court decision, said, "I concede." So yes, it will be watched, and I think many of the countries have a preference for who they hope will win. Different countries have different preferences, but yeah, the spotlight is on the United States, and hopefully there will be that at least the mechanics of the election will be fairly routine, and people won't have grounds for saying it was a fraudulent election. The issues will be legal rather than mechanical.
One final question among the others are asking about polling. How much faith do you have in polls after what happened in 2016?
That's a great question to end on, because the polls were very close in 2016, and actually they did predict that Clinton would win more popular votes than Trump did, which she did. They did not and they basically said that it's too close to call in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which it was. It broke very, very slightly for Trump, and all three of those states had to do that. They found out something which surprised me, that they hadn't sort of taken into account in 2016, and that was that they did not test for education level as they should have. That seems like a no-brainer to me. As I'm thinking and studying polling, I kind of assumed that would be that they would weight that in some appropriate way. Apparently, it was inappropriately weighted, and a lot of whites, a disproportionate number of whites who did not have a college degree, voted for Trump, and they didn't catch that in the polls. This year, there's an interesting dynamic, and again, I don't know how or if they can detect it, but there are reports of Trump voters trolling the polls and basically saying when they'll complete a poll, and when asked, who do you plan to vote for? They'll either say, I'm undecided, or I'm going to vote for Biden, when in fact, they know they're voting for Trump, and they will vote for Trump, or have already. So it wouldn't take much of that to mess up a sample. I don't know how much of that's going on, hopefully not much. And I don't know what pollsters are doing about that, but there is that. And so I think Democrats worry about that. And we'll see. We'll certainly know in a week and a half whether that was a factor of any kind.
Ah, phew. We got through it, Dr. Smith. Thank you very much. This has been we see, I'm hoping the Columbia College community gets to see why we rely on your interpretation and your analysis of the election. So thank you, Dr. Smith. Here's your email address for everyone if they'd like to privately send Dr. Smith a quick email or follow up a commentary or hello. I want to thank my colleagues in the Alumni Relations Office. That's Carolyn Pruill, Associate Director of Advanced Communications, Kiana Austin, Administrative Assistant Alumni Relations, and Kevin Fletcher. He's the Strategic Communications Specialist in Enrollment Management for assisting me today. I advise you to continue to keep connected with Columbia College, and we have upcoming events coming, on your screen. November 5th, we're having a LinkedIn workshop. That's a part of our career workshop. Veterans Day services will be broadcast on Veterans Day, November 11th. And we are having the opening of the dedication of the Brigadier General Charles E. McGee House, home of the Alsley Family Veteran Services Center. All these events can be found at mycc.edu/events. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Smith, and my colleagues for this presentation of Cougar Conversations. Have a great evening.